Hey guys, welcome to my video on vaccination myths. In support of World Vaccination Week and the WHO, we're going to debunk some common vaccine myths together. So hop on and let me guide you through the world of preventative medicine. Kevin here clearly doesn't like getting his shots, and I'm betting neither do you, but that's no excuse for making stuff up to avoid a 2-second ouchie. Our first myth, and probably our most common myth, is that vaccines cause autism. So a bit of history for you. The myth started in 1997 when The Lancet, which is usually a pretty reputable journal, published a paper by Andrew Wakefield claiming that there was a link between the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, MMR, and autism. Now there's a lot of problems with the paper. It suffered from poor design with a sample size of only 12 pre-selected children. There were undisclosed financial conflicts of interest as well as ethical violations. After the paper was found to be fraudulent, Andrew Wakefield lost his medical license, and the paper was retracted. Further research didn't find any link between getting a vaccine and the likelihood of developing autism. So why did this myth develop? Well, there's two reasons. The first is that autism usually becomes apparent around the same time that the MMR vaccine is given. So there's a classic mistake between confusing correlation with causation. The same fallacy is also being used to link MMR to SIDS or SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So that's also a false conclusion. Secondly, the vaccine contains a compound called ethyl mercury, also known as thimerosal. Some people hear mercury and freak out, assuming that this is a neurotoxic compound like the mercury we see in movies or mining projects. So methyl mercury, which ethyl mercury is confused for, is neurotoxic, but ethyl mercury is not and safe, especially in the very low doses found in vaccines. And just to be doubly safe, thimerosal was removed from all vaccines after 2001 in America because of the public outrage and the confusion. Studies from 3 different countries compared the incidence of autism after thimerosal was removed and before it was removed, and found that there was no decrease in autism rates after the removal. So in 1992, Europe removed it, and in 2001, the US removed it. And in both cases, the incidence of autism didn't change. Myth number 2, vaccines can overwhelm the immune system. The concern here is that a child's immune system can't handle the number of antigens found in a vaccine. Although it is true that more vaccines are given today than a few decades ago, the number of actual antigens found in vaccines is a lot less. In 1980, there were 3,000 antigens in the vaccine regimen given, and today there are just 35, anywhere from 1 to 14 per shot. On top of the low antigen number in modern vaccines, in our daily lives we're exposed to trillions of antigens. Everything from breathing, eating, to walking outside exposes us to massive amounts of bacteria and viruses, all of which are handled by our immune systems flawlessly. So, if we put a vaccine in that context, it only uses a tiny portion of our immune system. Based on the number of antibodies in the body, a baby could theoretically be given 10,000 vaccines at one time. Even if all 14 of the scheduled childhood vaccines are given at the same time, it would only use up 0.1% of a baby's total immune capacity. So the myth is that vaccines can overwhelm the immune system, but the immune system is built to handle way more in terms of load. Myth number 3, natural is better. This is the myth that actually getting a disease builds up stronger immunity than getting a vaccine. Although it's true that in some cases catching a disease does produce a stronger immune response than a vaccine, let's consider this fact in context, the context of risk versus benefit. So what are the risks of actually catching a disease that we commonly vaccinate for? Let's take measles or hepatitis or any of the diseases we can vaccinate for, whooping cough, etc. In this case, we have to consider the lifelong side effects of getting these diseases, such as brain damage, liver failure, deafness, blindness, limb loss, and even death. So let's compare risks to risks. What are the risks of getting a vaccine? In that case, the worst case scenario is developing a severe immune reaction. This happens extremely rarely. It's considered a 1 in a million chance. So let's compare the risk of measles vaccine to getting measles. In measles vaccine, you have a 1 in a million chance of an allergic reaction, but a 1 in 500 chance of dying of measles, and an even higher chance of another side effect like hearing loss, for example. So, every once in a while, a patient will come to your office and bring a paper from the VAERS, or Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And many of these studies suffer from correlation and causation fallacies, or poor design. Just to hammer home my point here, here's a fun little correlation: the divorce rate in Maine versus margarine consumption. And as you can see, they are pretty well correlated. So clearly, healthier marriages require less margarine consumption. Now you can see just how silly doing a correlation study is and confusing it for causation. Myth number 4, vaccines need to be spaced out in order to be more safe and more effective. So here's the deal. The immunization schedule has been determined over decades of medical evidence, showing that there is an optimal window for maintaining immunity and preventing disease, especially in the most vulnerable, unvaccinated children and the elderly. Spacing out vaccines not only limits their effectiveness, but also increases office visits, results in more injections, as well as higher out-of-pocket costs. So overall, it's more expensive and more uncomfortable to space out vaccines, despite many people wanting to because they think it's too much for the body to handle, which, as we talked about before, it's not. Myth number 5 is a pretty common one, and it's that vaccines contain unsafe toxins. So vaccines do contain trace amounts of formaldehyde, mercury, and aluminum, but the key word here is trace. The amounts of these compounds are so low that you actually get more of these in your system just by living your daily life than you would ever get from a vaccine. Actually, these ingredients are necessary for safe and effective vaccine production. Let's dive into each of these and describe the myths around them, as well as why they're false. So first, we talked about mercury and its link to autism, which is clearly false. That's the thimerosal compound we discussed before. It's entirely been removed from all vaccines since 2001 because of the public outcry, and even if you got a shot before 2001, rest assured that the mercury exposure you get from just drinking milk, eating seafood, even contact lens solution, builds up more of that compound in your system than you would get from a vaccine. So overall, not an issue. Next, we have formaldehyde. This is used to detoxify diphtheria and tetanus toxins or inactivate viruses. The funny thing here is your body's metabolism actually produces more formaldehyde daily than you would get from a vaccine. On top of that, we are constantly exposed to formaldehyde in our environment. The small doses you get from automobile exhaust, cosmetics, felt tip markers, mouthwash, and even medications like antihistamines and cough drops are higher than the vaccine dose. Finally, we have aluminum. Aluminum is used in vaccines, so they require less antigen to produce a robust immune response. There's a maximum of 125 milligrams of aluminum in vaccines. We consume 50 milligrams of aluminum in food, water, and medicine almost daily. So 3 days of just eating normally would produce more than the aluminum dose of a vaccine. And more vaccines are usually close to 0.6 milligrams than they are to 125. So overall, such a small dose that's not going to make an impact on your health. Myth number 6 is that vaccines are ineffective. Study after study has shown that vaccines are 95 to nearly 100% effective on developing immunity towards their target. Now, if you don't believe the CDC or the FDA, you can just look at history. The number of cases of every vaccine-preventable disease plummets in the years after the vaccine is given. Let's look at measles, for example. The vaccine was licensed in the US in 1963. Between 1958 and 1962, there's more than 500,000 reported cases of measles and over 432 deaths. In 1965, both the incidence and deaths began a 33-year downward trend towards the point where 1998 had 0 deaths from measles, and we would like to keep it that way. So please continue taking these vaccines in order to prevent these diseases from coming back because they haven't been totally eradicated. Myth number 7 is that vaccines cause the disease they are meant to prevent. This myth came from the fact that old vaccines like the polio Sabin vaccine contained a live virus, and in a person with a weak immune state, it had the ability to reactivate, which even then happened very rarely. Sabin has since been discontinued and nobody uses it anymore. Vaccines today contain either dead components of a virus or a whole virus in its inactivated state, so it can't replicate inside your body. So all the vaccines components today are totally safe and will not give you the actual disease. Why this myth has occurred is because sometimes people confuse the symptoms after they get a vaccine, maybe a mild fever or some swelling, for the disease itself. This is not the disease. This is your body reacting to the antigens presented in the vaccine, maybe going a little overboard. This just means the vaccine is working. Myth number 8 is that vaccinations decisions only affect me and my child and no one else, a sort of my body, my choice mentality to vaccines, which in this context is totally false. This is false because we live in communities where herd immunity is vital to protecting our vulnerable populations. What do I mean by vulnerable? Well, that's our immunocompromised and our vaccine allergic patients. These people who cannot get vaccinated benefit from you not spreading the disease by being immune to it. So the fact that you are vaccinated is protecting them. Not getting vaccinated is like failing to stop at a four-way intersection. If 3 people stop and 1 doesn't, the risk of an accident is very small. If 2 or 3 people don't stop, the risk is much higher for everyone at the intersection. So in conclusion, your decision affects the health of your community. So get vaccinated to prevent the disease spreading to those who can't. You are helping others. Myth number 9, and our final myth that we're going to cover, is that abortions are required to produce vaccines. This myth stemmed from the fact that the varicella, rubella, rabies virus, and hepatitis A vaccines are grown in human cell cultures. 2 human cell lines were provided for these cultures from 2 legally aborted fetuses in the 1960s. The donor fetuses were not aborted for the purpose of obtaining these cells, and these cells have been reused for 40 years with no fetal tissue required on top of that. So the myth that vaccine production requires abortions is totally false. These tissues were acquired ethically from fetuses that were not aborted for this purpose, and no fetuses have been used since. Finally, let's quickly talk about the COVID-19 vaccine that's being worked on right now. There are 3 countries leading the race. There's China, Russia, and the US, and they've all developed vaccines that are currently in their phase 3 trials. The issue is that these phase 3 trials are either being shortened or rushed in order to get the vaccine out to the public. The point of a phase 3 trial is in order to have large-scale testing for adverse events to test if the vaccine is safe and will cause any adverse reactions in people. So these phase 3 trials are for safety. The problem is if we rush these phase 3 trials and then it turns out there is an adverse event that wasn't planned for, a lot of people can suffer. So having proper timetables and taking the full amount of time required for phase 3 is vital for patient safety, but we have to weigh that against the benefit that the vaccine could have in saving lives that are affected by the coronavirus. And if you still believe the myth that Bill Gates is trying to vaccinate you in order to microchip you, just consider that you carry your phone everywhere you go. There are easier ways of tracking where you're going.